Greetings, overly literal squighounds, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
We fancied doing something a little bit different today, a little bit subjective, and what could be more subjective than the appreciation of art? When covering a rulebook in this series, we'll often acknowledge the cover art and its artist. And one of the reasons for this is that we think it's often not appreciated enough how important this cover art is. There are several books where a particularly evocative piece has forever affected how we interpret the faction. A good cover encapsulates their identity in a single moment. I would not be shocked if some of you have ended up collecting an entire army purely because a particular bit of cover art was that cool. In short, 40k and Warhammer in general owe a lot to the massive swathe of artists that's done a lot of work for them over the years to go on and in all of their books.
And we wanted to celebrate that today by selecting our 10 favourite Warhammer 40k rulebook covers and presenting them to you in no particular order because we love all of our children equally. The books we selected from are the core rulebooks, expansions and codices. As long as it's on the front of a book with rules in it and the rules are for 40k itself, it's eligible. So no cover art for novels or internal art from rulebooks. Partially because if we included novels, we'd end up spending all month just sifting through more Black Library books than we can count, but mostly because if we included internal art, then this list would just be this image by Tony Huff where the Beaky looks like he's dunking a biscuit 10 times in a row. He's not dunking a biscuit, he's a medic putting gene seed into a container, but you will never make us actually see it as that. We refuse.
We tried to pick from all across the franchise's history, so it's not just a long string of, say, 3rd edition covers. And of course, our picks are entirely subjective and will absolutely differ from your own. This is just an excuse to talk about some art we like, and why. So, with all that said, let's get into it.
Let's start with one that's relatively new. The cover of the 9th edition version of Codex Chaos Knights is fantastic. Even better if you've got the limited edition version like we do, so you can see it without all the branding guff on it. This Henry Martinez piece is slightly unusual for a modern Codex cover, since it clearly shows a specific enemy being fought. Usually on these covers the faction is shooting at a poorly defined enemy completely off-screen, page, cover, whatever. But in having a knight bearing down on these ultramarines, it really cements how terrifying a single knight can be. If a Chaos Knight can so casually dispense with Space Marines with a Redemptor Dread no less, what could stop one? One answer is las cannons. Lots and lots of las cannons. But that's true of most things. Also, we are very enamoured with this guardsman in the foreground, turned to the viewer with an expression we can only describe as, "Mate, have you f***ing seen this?"
The covers of 2nd edition tend to stand out from other editions for their sheer vibrancy. And one of the most vibrant is Mark Gibbon's Orc Codex cover. Given Gazkul's here and there's a dead Dark Angel, it's all feeling very Persona 4. Which makes us remember that Eutechnics made a video game about that campaign. A game that somehow meant that Ride to Hell Retribution wasn't the least fun Eutechnics game that we've played. Anyway, this cover comes from an era of little guys. You know, where there's a bunch of fun little guys on the cover beside the main focus. Like Makari, this other grot, or this squighound that's taken the hound part of its name more seriously than most. Also, can a Gargant count as a little guy? I feel it should be allowed to be a little guy in this particular case. Just a big little guy. With the reds, yellows and greens providing bright colours to pop against all the dark grimy orc gubbins, this piece does a good job at capturing the look of this particular era of orc. The era where even the Goths, a faction known for wearing black, could still be mostly bright red.
It's not totally uncommon for cover art to get reused from time to time, just ask Jim Burns about that one Space Marine piece he did. But those reuses tend to happen pretty close together unless it's a limited edition thing. Not so with the cover art for the 3rd edition Demon Hunters Codex. This cover by Paul Dayton was first on a rulebook in 2003, so the fact they've brought it back for the Imperial Agents Codex 21 years later says something. The Inquisitors pose ready to twat some poor unfortunate soul, who is probably a demon so soul might be the wrong word, distracts you from the inquisitorial weirdos in the back, being very normal with bones as they are wont to do. The central character is, according to this Panini trading card, and some other places too I guess, Lord Inquisitor Kotiaz. A somewhat off-brand Kotiaz above the waist when you start looking closely at the details admittedly, but hey, would a trading card lie to you? Also, have to give them credit for not having the cover feature any Grey Knights. Having Marines in a Codex and not putting them front and centre takes a level of restraint that GW rarely shows. They are on the back though. All in all, it's a nice bit of cover art, and like all good Codex covers, it says something about the faction in question. Namely that if you are close to an Inquisitor, your chances of getting hit with a hammer have increased tenfold.
After being kind of ignored on the Codex front for most of 40k's life, the Adepta Sorus finally got a new Codex in late 2019. Which we didn't play a single game with because we, like we assume most of you, spent most of that year and a half that it was the current Codex dealing with that little pesky global pandemic thing. Bitterness aside, the art on that book was pretty nice. But if you bought the limited edition Sisters box, you got this little number, which we happen to think is a little bit nicer. Once again, it communicates something about the faction. It's not just soldiers going to battle, this is a quiet moment, where a lone sister has set aside her gun in a moment of prayer, her face shining brightly, illuminating and providing colour to an otherwise cold and dark universe. These are more than foot soldiers for an authoritarian regime. They're worse. They're foot soldiers for an authoritarian regime that have got something that may or may not be a god on their side. It also helps that, like the other limited edition cover we've shown, this one doesn't need all the 40k branding and titles on the front. It was never going to be on a shelf in this form, so the piece is just allowed to be. Sure, it's not as action-packed and exciting as the mainline version, but that makes it stand out in a world of covers where people are shooting and yelling at each other all the time.
Speaking of people shooting and yelling at each other, it's probably time we did a Space Marine Codex. This is another one from Paul Dayton and was used on the 9th edition Codex. We picked this one mostly because we just really love the colours used. The blue of the Ultramarines and the orange of the sky contrast off each other so nicely. It's not an unheard of combination, other covers have toyed with them, they are contrasting colours after all, but Dayton messed around with the shades of blue used to really bring out the most in that contrast. Plus the lighting makes the Central Marine's pink face stand out from the rest of the image, drawing your eyes in. And I just noticed the pink tones in the fire down here. Yeah, sorry, this one's all about the colours for us. Also, little guy alert.
There are some images that are quintessentially 40k. Iconic images that have stuck around even as the house style has changed. John Blanche's 2nd edition Sisters of Battle Codex art is one such image, as evidenced by the fact that they literally made it into a mini. This image really does show off that Blanche really did get the formula for artwork of the Imperium. It's sci-fi but with a hefty dose of gothic and religious flair, far more skulls than is absolutely necessary, a bit of body horror, something should be at least a little on fire, and all with just enough of a pinch of fetish art about it that it's not too much and causes the parents of 12-year-olds to return the books once they realise what little Tarquin is reading. Basically, it should look like a historical reenactment. The Vatican and the 1999 movie Virus were all smashed together and then decided to wear some thigh-high boots. And John Blanche was pretty dang good at depicting that. The 2nd Ed Sisters cover perfectly distilled this, leading to it becoming such an iconic image. To the point that I don't think it's possible that we could have made this list without including it. Well, I mean, we could have done, but you guys probably would have just yelled at us.
And since we're already discussing John Blanche, there is one more piece of his we'd like to talk about. The cover art to the 3rd edition rulebook, and by extension the box art for the box set, is a special piece to me since 3rd edition was the first edition that I played. So poring over this book in my early teens means that this art is forever emblazoned in my mind as just what 40k looks like. Like a lot of cover art, it's part of a larger piece, and wow does the larger piece look great, but what we have here stands well on its own. There's just something about the very visible brush strokes that Blanche uses that hits differently, you know? and the details here really make it shine. The red inlay you see on this Marine's pauldrons, the knee gorgon, this guy's unusual half gas mask, and is it any surprise that they once again eventually turned this guy into a mini? Even if they didn't capture his combi flamer that spits flames out of the hole that really shouldn't be spitting flames. Also, minor point, but not enough people's armies feature hazard stripes on their weapons anymore. You should do it, even if just a little. It's cool. Just because you aren't playing Iron Warriors is no excuse.
Codex covers that weren't a scene and were instead just like a guy representative of the whole faction were all the rage for a few editions, and for the most part we aren't super enthused by them. They do the job, but it's a very restrictive format that doesn't really feel like there's much room for the artists to spread their wings and really make a mark. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't covers from that era that we like. Take the 6th edition Chaos Space Marine Codex cover art by Ray Swanland that I really enjoy. This features a distinctly unusual Chaos Marine. It's kind of weird and off-model in a way that just kind of speaks to me. It's at the other end of the spectrum to the very clean and uniform look of many modern Marines. It almost feels like it's a modern version of something from the realm of Chaos books. Yeah, that's it for this one. I just think it's neat.
The Space Wolves are an interesting faction. Not only must they pull double duty as Space Marines whomst are also Vikings, and Space Marines whomst are also werewolves, but they've had a fair amount of variation in their colour scheme. Starting off light grey in the 80s, often described in the modern era in terms like "armour the dark grey of storm clouds on the eve of the murder make." But the actual models are painted in baby blue. Just little blue birthday boys. This means that the cover artists get quite a lot of freedom with how they choose to represent the Space Wolves, and our personal favourite cover of theirs is the one that graces the 5th edition Codex. It's beautiful, with the sketchier, vaguer details in the background forcing your gaze to the more detailed centre. These Marines barely look like the minis in the actual book in the best way. Darker in paint job, with the only big splashes of colour being the gold and red on the shoulders. They feel heavy, trudging through snow. The whole thing feels cold and inhospitable. It's all very pre-heresy. To us, this is the Space Wolves. As soon as we saw this was the only way we wanted them to look. On reflection, it's astounding neither of us has ever collected a Horus Heresy Space Wolf army.
Now the real tricky question is, who actually drew it? And that's an oddly difficult question, since this was around the time that GW were really cementing a unified house style, so the artist's individual flair was less pronounced. And the Codex does not specify, just giving a list of all the artists who worked on the book at once. It doesn't appear in any of their portfolios or online galleries that we could find. It's not available through the Warhammer art store, so we can't check there. It's listed as an Alex Boyd piece on the French, and only the French, language lexicanum. Most other places that do attempt to source it say it's a Paul Dayton. But most just don't seem to know. It was also used for things like Thunder from Fenris, but because they're Games Workshop, the art doesn't seem to be credited at all. However, after reaching out to our sources, and by that I mean Wib posting about it, we were directed to issue 358 of White Dwarf, which also had this art on the cover, and hey, look at that! The White Dwarf crew do know how to credit correctly, and so we now have confirmation that this is a Paul Dayton piece. Thanks to Trans Neon Green, Hobby and Slow and everyone else who chipped in on Blue Sky for helping to solve that particular mystery.
You might wonder why we spent a chunk of this video explaining that when we could have just said Dayton did it, but I spent a non-insignificant amount of time one Tuesday evening trying to figure this out and dragged a bunch of people down with me, so I felt like we kinda had to. And yes, I know I could have just sent Dayton a message on Instagram asking him if it was his, since I was pretty sure it was one of his from the start, but yeah, I really should have just done that, shouldn't I?
The first of something always has a certain specialness to it. I mean, there's a reason we all know what Action Comics #1 looks like, even though it's from 1938. And so we have to include the first piece of 40k art most people saw back in 1987. The Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader cover by John Sibbick. We think what makes this piece stand out is how well it sets up 40k from the very beginning. You could see this on a shelf in 1987 and know that Warhammer 40,000 is set in a brutal future. Mankind is not only at war, but they are overwhelmed. This band of powered armoured soldiers making a last stand in a bleak war zone amongst their dead and dying. The only thing we really see of their enemy is a severed head of a green-skinned alien held aloft. This is one of the many hints we have that the mankind shown in-game isn't an idealised future version of us, but a version where our worst traits are on display, with hints of fascistic imagery and spikes across the armour, letting us know that these may be humans, but you're not supposed to see them as the good guys. And yeah, that is basically Warhammer 40,000 in a nutshell. And even this style of cover with these very staged scenes evoke military artwork of times past, in particular artwork of Britain's colonial wars. This is a type of warfare that should be in the history books, but there it is, still being fought in the grim darkness of the far future. Also, how the bolt guns are represented firing looks like horseshoe crabs, which I think is really cute, actually.
So there we go, there's our 10 favourites. We picked them with no idea who drew many of them initially, so in this process we also found out that Paul Dayton must be one of our favourite 40k artists since he showed up so much. So that's fun. I'm sure the exact ones we picked would change depending on the day, the humidity, or what we had for lunch, but for right now, these are our favourites. Why don't you let us know what your favourite piece of 40k cover art is in the comments? And whilst you're there, don't forget to like the video. Now we know that this was nearly all Imperial or Imperial adjacent, and in specific there's a whole lot of Space Marines in there. But in our defence, Space Marines get like a dozen books each edition now, meaning that just over half of all 40k rulebooks have a Space Marine on the cover. That's not an exaggeration, we checked. So 5 out of 10 is about what you'd expect. Oh wait, they're also on these two as well, so it's actually 7. God damn it.
Also, it really sucks how many pieces are so hard to credit correctly. Like the limited edition 8th Ed Sisters cover is not credited in the book, it isn't on the Warhammer art site, and the only place we can find any credit at all was when it was used as a variant cover of the 3rd issue of the Marvel Sisters of Battle comic run, where as far as we can tell it's just credited to Games Workshop. Classy. If only there was an easy way to credit a cover artist. Oh wait, it's incredibly easy and they used to just do it all the time. The non-limited edition 8th Ed Sisters cover is by Paul Dayton, by the way, so it would be funny if it turned out that he did this mystery one as well.
Still, regardless of how well GW credits them, all the artists featured here, along with all the others who've produced art for 40k over the years, have absolutely shaped the way we see the grim darkness of the far future, and they have inspired countless other people to pick up a pencil themselves. And we just think that in this time when artists find their work stolen and reconstituted into vastly inferior and soulless AI art, it's important to remember how meaningful the work done by actual flesh and blood artists is. The artists of tomorrow are inspired by the art of today, and that includes the stuff that some people may think of as silly, like the art they see on the rulebooks for their toy soldiers. Lord knows they've inspired a few pieces from us. So thank you, cover artists, for making 40k that much better.
And also for making it feel less like we're buying the same book every 3 years. Because sometimes it kind of feels like it.
Hello there, fellow art appreciators. If you appreciated whatever this was, please consider liking and subbing and all that jazz. If you wish to support this cry for help we call a YouTube channel in a monetary fashion, then please head over to patreon.com/snipeandwib. You'll get to see these videos a day or so early and get your name in the end of the videos, just like these powerful individuals to whom we owe our continued existence. Oh, we also have like t-shirts and stickers with in-jokes on them that will alienate you from your peers if that's something you're into. Links may be found in the terrifying depths of the video description. But regardless, we hope you enjoyed this and we'll see you next time.